The costumes, the hair. There's only one ABBA. And after decades of going their own way, the Swedish supergroup...
There are moments in history when an artist steps out from behind the curtain, not to perform, not to promote, but simply to tell the truth. For Benny Andersson, one of the quiet architects behind one of the most beloved bands the world has ever known, that moment has finally arrived. At 78 years old, with decades of distance between him and the roaring heights of ABBA's fame, Benny is saying things he once kept locked inside piano keys and orchestral arrangements. And what he's saying is changing the way we understand not just ABBA, but music itself. The story of ABBA has always been told through a certain lens: glittering costumes, euphoric choruses, sold-out arenas, and the fairy tale image of two couples making magic together on the world stage. It was a story the public loved. It was clean, radiant, and easy to celebrate. But Benny Andersson, now looking back from the quiet of his later years, is offering a different version. One that is messier, more honest, and ultimately far more moving than anything the headlines ever captured. Before ABBA, before the Grammy nominations and the stadium tours and the merchandise empires, there was a boy in Sweden who simply loved sound. Benny Andersson grew up in a home where music was not a career ambition. It was a way of breathing. His grandfather played the accordion. His father sang. Melodies were how the family communicated things that ordinary words couldn't quite reach. From a very early age, Benny understood that music had an emotional architecture, that a chord could carry grief, that silence between notes could say more than the notes themselves. He was not the kind of child who dreamed of fame. He was the kind of child who sat at a piano for hours, not to impress anyone, but because it was the one place where everything made sense. He absorbed Swedish folk traditions, church harmonies, and the emotional weight of classical composition long before he ever walked into a professional recording studio. By the time he became a working musician in his teens, playing in local bands across Stockholm, his understanding of music was already more sophisticated than most artists twice his age would ever develop. This is important context, because when people try to understand why ABBA's music has outlasted almost every other pop act from the 1970s, the answer almost always begins with Benny Andersson and the unusual emotional depth he quietly embedded in songs that were, on the surface, simply designed to make people dance. When ABBA exploded onto the global stage following their 1974 Eurovision victory with Waterloo, the world fell in love with Agnetha Faltskog and Anni-Frid Lyngstad. Their voices, their beauty, their charisma, these were the things cameras chased and magazines celebrated. Benny and Bjorn Ulvaeus, standing slightly back, slightly out of frame, were acknowledged as the songwriting force behind the group, but rarely examined with much depth. They were described, somewhat lazily, as the men behind the music, a phrase that technically contained truth, but entirely missed the point. Benny, in particular, was the one who shaped what ABBA actually sounded like. Not just the melodies, but the emotional texture. The way a song about dancing could suddenly feel like it was about longing. The way a major key chorus could carry a minor key heartache underneath it. He was working with layered harmonics, with the tension between chords, with the emotional mathematics of when to build and when to strip everything away. These were not accidents. They were the deliberate choices of a musician who had been thinking about these things since childhood. He spent enormous hours in the studio, far beyond what was expected or even noticed. There are accounts of Benny replaying a single-string arrangement dozens of times, adjusting the tempo by fractions, experimenting with early synthesizer technology in ways that were genuinely pioneering for the era. While other pop acts of the 1970s were working with simpler, more conventional production, ABBA was building something that sounded lush, cinematic, and deeply layered. That was Benny's doing. And for much of the band's active years, it went largely without acknowledgement outside the music industry itself. He has spoken in recent years about what it felt like to watch the public narrative form around ABBA and to recognize himself barely at all inside it, not with bitterness toward his bandmates. He is careful to make that distinction, but with a quiet frustration at how creativity gets filtered through the lens of image and visibility. He gave everything to those songs, and the world mostly remembered the faces. His relationship with Frida, Anni-Frid Lyngstad, was one of the most significant personal chapters of the ABBA years, and also one of the least understood. They were together through much of the band's rise, eventually marrying in 1978, and their connection was real and complicated and very much shaped by the particular way each of them moved through the world emotionally. Frida was, by most accounts, someone who felt things loudly and immediately. She brought that energy to her performances. The rawness in her voice was not manufactured. It was simply the natural expression of a woman who had experienced genuine loss and was not afraid to let that show. Her early life had included real hardship and abandonment, and she carried those experiences honestly. Benny, by contrast, was someone who processed emotion inwardly. He did not retreat from feeling. If anything, he felt things deeply, but his instinct was always to translate those feelings into music rather than conversation. When he was struggling, he sat at the piano. When he was confused, he wrote a chord progression. When he was in pain, he arranged strings. The studio was where his interior life actually lived. This fundamental difference in emotional expression made them creatively complementary and personally incompatible at the same time. What made their collaboration so charged? That contrast between Frida's open-hearted expressiveness and Benny's architectural emotional restraint was also what made their relationship quietly difficult. She needed someone who could meet her in conversation. He was better at meeting her in a key change. Benny has reflected on this in ways that are notable for their honesty and lack of self-justification. He does not pretend he was easy to be with. He acknowledges that he used the studio as a kind of emotional avoidance, that pouring feelings into a song meant not having to say them directly. He admits that this was not fair to the people around him, and he admits that some of ABBA's most emotionally resonant songs were born from moments when he should have simply put down the sheet music and had a real conversation. This realization, that Benny used music as a shield as much as a medium, reframed some of ABBA's most iconic material in fascinating ways. Songs that the public received as anthems, as celebration or heartbreak or disco floor euphoria, were often something more personal and more complicated in their origin. Benny has spoken about how the tension in the band's romantic relationships found its way directly into the music during the late 1970s, as both his partnership with Frida and Bjorn's marriage to Agnetha were beginning to fracture. The group continued recording and performing even as the personal dynamics were unraveling, and the songs they made during that period carry something in them that listeners have always sensed without quite being able to name, an emotional weight that exceeds what the lyrics alone would suggest. This is part of what makes ABBA's music endure in a way that much of the pop from their era simply does not. Most popular music ages because it reflects the surface of its moment, the fashion, the production style, the cultural references. ABBA's music ages differently because it was built on something more fundamental. It was built on actual human experience, actual emotional complexity, actual pain that was being transmuted into melody in real time. Benny didn't just write catchy songs. He wrote confessions that he was not yet ready to make out loud. And here is the profound irony that he now recognizes clearly. The music that connected ABBA to hundreds of millions of people around the world was also what kept the band members from truly connecting with each other. When you can put your most difficult feelings into a song, you don't have to do the harder work of sitting across from someone and speaking plainly. The music became a language so sophisticated, so beautiful, and so complete that it almost replaced the need for ordinary human honesty. ABBA did not end dramatically. There was no single incident, no explosive confrontation, no moment that anyone could point to and say, there, that is where it broke. What happened was slower and quieter, and in some ways, harder to process precisely because it lacked the shape of a story. By the early 1980s, the creative energy that had defined the band's peak years had simply exhausted itself. The touring had been relentless. The expectation to continuously produce hit material was unceasing, and the personal relationships within the group, already strained, had quietly collapsed. Bjorn and Agnetha had divorced in 1979. Benny and Frida would follow in 1981. The four people who had made music together were now navigating the wreckage of their personal lives, while still being expected to perform as a unified, joyful entity for the public. Benny has said something particularly revealing about this period, that he stayed in the band not because he wanted to, but because he felt he owed it to the others. Obligation replaced passion. The sense of creative excitement that had made those early years genuinely thrilling had faded, and what remained was a kind of professional duty, the feeling that leaving would be a betrayal. So he stayed, and made music that no longer felt fully honest to him, and quietly began to disappear from the inside of his own career. The end, when it came, was barely marked by anything at all. The members drifted into separate projects. There was no farewell tour, no final statement, no formal announcement of conclusion. ABBA simply stopped, and the world noticed only afterward. What came after was a period of genuine reckoning that the public rarely saw. Benny moved into composing for theater and film, projects that were more personal, more controlled, and entirely free of the machinery that had surrounded ABBA. He worked on the musical chess, composed large orchestral works, and eventually created Christina, Fran de Wemela, a deeply personal Swedish epic that many critics consider his finest achievement. These post-ABBA years were not simply a career change. They were a form of reconstruction. Benny was working through things in music that he had never been able to address during the band's active years, emotions that had been compressed and redirected and transformed into pop songs rather than confronted directly. The theater gave him room to work on a different scale, with different emotional stakes, outside the pressure of mass commercial expectation. He has spoken about keeping journals during the 1990s, writing things he never sent and never shared, letters to former bandmates, to Frida, to his younger self, attempts to understand what had actually happened during those years and what it had cost him. This private work of emotional archaeology was something he undertook largely alone, and it shaped the person he has become in his later decades, more reflective, more willing to speak plainly, more interested in honesty than image. At 78, Benny Andersson is not the same man who sat in the ABBA recording studio adjusting harmonics into the early hours of the morning. He is older, quieter in a different way, and in possession of something he lacked for much of his most famous years: perspective. What he has confirmed, in various interviews and reflections over recent years, is something that fans and observers have long suspected, but never heard stated so directly. ABBA was not a fairy tale. It was not the effortless product of four perfectly matched people who were happy and fulfilled and united in creative bliss. It was something far more human, a group of real people with real damage, real fear, real emotional limitations, who somehow found in music a shared language powerful enough to transcend all of that, at least for a time. The music worked, Benny now believes, precisely because it was built on genuine feeling rather than manufactured emotion. The sadness underneath the joyful songs was real sadness. The longing in the ballads was real longing. The tension that listeners could feel, without quite naming it, was the actual tension of four people trying to hold themselves together while everything around them, and sometimes between them, was quietly coming apart. This is what he confirms, finally and openly, that ABBA's greatest gift to the world was also its most honest secret. The band did not shine despite its pain. It shone because of it. The music gave all four of them a place to put the things they could not say otherwise. And in doing so, they created something that has outlasted every trend, every era, every argument about whether pop music can be taken seriously as art. There is something quietly radical about a man at 78 choosing honesty over legacy management. Benny Andersson could have spent his later years simply accepting the celebration that ABBA now receives, the tribute shows, the museum, the Mamma Mia films, the 2021 reunion album, without adding any complication to the story. He could have let the fairy tale stand undisturbed. Instead, he is doing something braver. He is saying, we were human. We were broken in specific ways. We used music to survive things we didn't know how to face directly. And the music was real because we were real. Not because we were perfect, but because we were genuinely struggling and genuinely feeling. And all of that found its way into the songs, whether we intended it to or not. He is also saying something about his own particular form of emotional expression, his tendency to let the piano do the talking, to arrange feelings rather than speak them. That carries both insight and regret. He understands now that there is a cost to translating everything into art, that the people around you sometimes need to hear the words, not the melody. That genius in one area does not exempt a person from the ordinary responsibilities of human connection. And he is saying it not to rewrite history, but to complete it, to add the dimension that was always there but never fully visible, to offer the full picture of what ABBA was, not as the world imagined it, but as it actually existed, four complex, vulnerable, extraordinary people who made music that will outlast all of them, and who paid a price for it that the world never had to see. What Benny Andersson has given us, in these later years of reflection, is not a scandal and not a revision. It is a deepening. The songs sound the same, but they mean more now. The Winner Takes It All was always a great song. Knowing more about the human experience behind it makes it something closer to a document, a record of what it actually felt like to be inside that moment, written by someone who could only express it indirectly, through chord and melody and the carefully controlled space between notes. ABBA's music has always made people feel things they couldn't quite explain. Now, perhaps, we understand a little better why. The man who built that music was himself feeling things he couldn't quite explain, and the songs were his best attempt at honesty in the only language that came naturally to him. At 78, Benny Andersson has finally said what the music was always trying to say. And it turns out we were right to feel what we felt every time we listened. We were hearing the truth. We just didn't know it yet. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. And stay with us for more stories that go beyond the headlines.